Good morning to everybody, and you're very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar. I hope you're all keeping well and looking forward to another very interesting presentation. We're going to do things a little bit differently this morning. So today we're going to look back at the Extensive Grassland Biodiversity keynote address by Professor John Feehan from the recent Teagasc and Heritage Council event in Birr. And to tell us more about the event, we're delighted to be joined this morning by Catherine Casey from the Heritage Council. Catherine, good morning to you.
Good morning, Cathal. How are you?
Not too bad. Where are you based today, Catherine?
I'm down in Kilkenny at the Heritage Council headquarters.
Excellent. And whether good or bad or indifferent, we always talk about weather in this program.
It's one of those days, it's kind of doing nothing.
Nondescript. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And we're also joined by Teagasc Countryside Management Specialist, Dr. Catherine Keena. Good morning, Catherine. How are you?
How are you? Hello.
You're in a lovely field there.
I am a lovely field of Keens in Limerick of species-rich grassland, which inspired our day out in Birr.
Yeah. Is that a sheepdog behind you, I see?
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah.
Catherine, I suppose we're going to talk a little about Birr today. Maybe just to kick off, maybe tell us a bit about the event.
Yeah, look, I'm passionate about the extensive grassland that we have in Ireland. We could have up to 1 million hectares of it. That's not to take away from the valuable ryegrass swards that we have, which produce a lot of food and less biodiversity. And then we have the extensive grassland that does produce food and must be grazed, so we must keep it in farming, but has a huge biodiversity. So it adds to our whole agriculture and biodiversity industry. So that was the theme for this year's national biodiversity event. And we went to Birr and we went to Professor John Feehan, who is the inspiration of all my work.
Excellent. And Catherine Casey, can you tell us a little about how I suppose the collaboration between our Teagasc and yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Cathal. I suppose we're delighted in the Heritage Council to be working together with Teagasc on a number of issues. Our farmland and our biodiversity, as Catherine Keena said, there are so hugely intertwined that it's really important that the state bodies that are responsible for both are working together. Part of my role at the Heritage Council is the rollout and the management of the local authority biodiversity officer programme. So we have a programme going now. We've got a biodiversity officer in almost every local authority in the country. And a big part of what Catherine and I have been working on in our collaboration is making sure that the Teagasc staff, the local advisors that are all across the country, and these biodiversity officers are working together, that they're singing from the same hymn sheet. I suppose a lot of the time they're working with similar people on similar schemes, and that the expertise that each have will really complement each other. So some of the collaborations that we've had in the past have been Hedgerow Week, which again is running again this year in September, where there's Teagasc events and biodiversity officer events, and often there's joint events as well. And this Extensive Grassland Day in Birr was one key part of that, where Teagasc staff again on the ground were leading walks in the extensive grassland, and biodiversity officers also were talking about the ecological side of that grassland. So I think they really complement the expertise they have, really complements each other.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something there about singing off the same hymn sheet, and I think no matter what part of the environment we're looking at now, to take confusion away from farmers, we have to be saying the same message. So, Catherine Keena, like it is vitally important we all talk to each other and we are work together, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we always want the end goal, but sometimes people say things differently, but it's very important that we understand each other, where we're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah,
On all aspects of the environment.
It always reminds me of Dr. Google. Google will tell you one thing, but the doctor will tell you another. So we want to make sure we get the right message out there anyway, that's for sure. And just supposed to remind everybody today that we are going to be recording today's session, and please do submit your questions to the Q&A tab. And we'll be slightly time on questions today, but if we don't get to them today, we will get to them next week. This is part one of a two-part event, a two-part series. And just to remind everybody also that this is it's on a podcast version as well of the Signpost Series webinar, available to listen when you're out and about and on the move. So to kick off today, we're going to actually, Professor John Feehan actually recorded a presentation in Birr on the day, and we're going to play that video today. It's an excellent video, well worth looking at, and it's run for about 45 minutes, and after the 45 minutes we'll stop and we'll have a chat to Catherine Keena and Catherine Casey.
And Cathal, just before you do, don't forget to mention the book.
Yes.
Or maybe I should mention the book.
Yeah.
I think I was meant to. Apologies. So on the day we launched the reprinted version of the Grasses of Ireland book. So it's just to make sure anybody who wishes to get a copy of that gets it before it's out of print again. So yeah, you contact Teagasc in Oak Park for that.
And I have a feeling that book will go quick, Catherine. So
I
you'd
have a
want to be
feeling
in.
that'll go quick.
Yeah. It's a good book. Yeah. So well worth getting in there quickly. Yep. So with that, I'll tell you what to do. I'll get this video going now, and I'm going to share a screen. And Catherine, you let me know if any of the technology goes wrong, and we'll kick off. And just to remind everybody as well, when the video starts, you may need to turn up your volume a slight bit just to hear it a bit better. But with that, we'll kick off.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Birr. I feel I can almost say this in an official capacity.
Is that working
because
okay,
I was born
Catherine?
here, I grew up here, and I'm back here for what's left. And actually, it's fitting that Birr should have the honour of hosting this particular event. One reason that mightn't strike you, in fact, is that once upon a time, we used to consider Birr to be the very centre of Ireland. If you look at that bit of Latin at the top, the Birr, in the middle and the very centre of the land. We even had a big stone at one time in the market square, marking the actual spot, which was the official centre of Ireland. Anyway, that's not the real reason. The real reason, of course, we're here for this event in Burcastle is the meadow in Burcastle Domain, which is a rare example of the traditional species diverse meadow that was only a lifetime ago an essential part of every farm. And for most of the history of farming in Ireland, it contained most of the farm's natural diversity. Now, farmland, of course, in Ireland is still overwhelmingly grassland. But recent surveys here, just going back a couple of years ago, have shown that the habitat that has shown the greatest decline in biodiversity over recent decades is grassland. Over the last 90 years, I mean, some of these figures, and there'll be more to come, are staggering in their implications. Over the last 90 years, the number of 10 kilometre squares occupied by native species has declined by 56%. And the decline in species diverse grassland is particularly severe. Now, apart from the decline of grassland as a habitat, which is part of an international trend anyway, we are near the bottom of the table when it comes to biodiversity in overall terms. I mean, isn't it hard to believe that a recent survey ranked the Republic of Ireland 13th from the bottom for biodiversity intactness out of 240 countries? And there's only 1 point in the difference in Northern Ireland. Now, as we all know, of course, what characterizes modern farming is intensification, particularly the use of lots of artificial and natural fertilizers, mechanization, reliance on a very narrow range of high-yielding grasses and highly productive animal breeds. But if you had hopped on a train in Birr, which you could have done actually 60 or 70 years ago when we had a station, or Tullamore, and gone east or west for Dublin or Galway, nearly all the farmland you saw through the window would have qualified as what we now call high nature value grassland, because of the diversity of flowering plants, 40 to 50 species as often as not in an average field. And this is what you will see today. Over the intervening decades, these fields have been transformed, mainly through reseeding with ryegrass and the application of fertilizers nobody could afford before this, but also as a result of reclamation and drainage, hedgerow removal, field enlargement, the use of other petroleum-derived agrochemicals, changes in grazing breeds and the pattern of grazing, and a whole lot of other changes which we're all familiar with, including the general abandonment of mixed farming. Much of the reduction in biological diversity in farm grassland can be attributed to the burgeoning of all of these agricultural inputs, especially fertilizers that accompanied intensification, resulting in the replacement of a species-diverse ecosystem with highly productive systems of minimal diversity. This is what the modernization of grassland farming was all about. A pattern pioneered on more progressive farms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and then put forward as the model to be followed when it became possible to extend the intensive paradigm to middle and small-sized farms with the development of the CAP. All of this resulted in greatly increased productivity, where this is measured in quantity of forage in a given area, without appreciating or factoring in such other criteria as forage nutritional quality, environmental impacts, and all the rest of it. You see, global warming and biodiversity didn't exist for us back then, nor was there any awareness of the population explosion and the challenge of feeding 10 billion in a water-challenged world. In fact, the word biodiversity itself was only invented in the late 1980s. With the new markets that opened up after our accession to the European Economic Community in 1973, and the more affluent quality of life that widened markets at home, all of this had a profoundly positive effect on farm livelihoods. But it also had the effect of reducing the abundance of most native species of flowering plants and herbs, not wiping them out, but greatly reducing their abundance. And this happened slowly and incrementally, and you would hardly have noticed because our minds were on other things. And it wasn't just the flowers that disappeared from the fields. Let's take a closer look for a moment at the meadow of the well-run traditional farm, with its greater variety of species, for which there was a very good reason. Before artificial fertilizers were invented, and we're talking broadly for lime in the 1840s and nitrate and ammonia sometime around 1913 only, before that, a largely forgotten body of practical understanding of the value of different forage species had been gathered through long experience over many generations, along with the practical knowledge needed to maximize productivity through its application to particular rotations. Today, there is an extraordinarily widespread lack of awareness of the sophistication and productivity of best practice within the agronomic systems prevailing immediately before the triumph of agrochemicals. And we may not be aware of the extent to which the superiority of the new system was promoted by eager advocates of the developing agrochemical industry. And with regard to the superior productivity of the new ryegrass clover sward, it is not, in fact, that much more productive than the best practice of the past, and not in a league of its own, as it were. Part of the reason we are not aware of the scale and extent of past achievement is that it was so more or less completely abandoned with the advent of misleadingly labeled, more scientific artificial nutrient substitutes, all the more readily at a time when these were cheap and easy to use, requiring nothing of the sophisticated understanding of species diversity, rotation management, or soil ecology the earlier grassland management demanded. Here is a page from the trials book from the Department of Agriculture's Albert College in 1906, where they were experimenting with the performance of 29 species of grasses and legumes in great detail over many years. But as has happened so often in the history of human progress, in solving the problem of the nutrient bottleneck with the discovery of how to synthesize nitrogen compounds, we created the new problems we are faced with today. It's a classic example of the informal third law of ecology elucidated by Barry Commoner back in 1971. When we intervene in the complex workings of a natural system, we need to know not only the effect of our intervention is going to be, but what the effects of the effects will be. And one of the most important lines of research today by people like Helen Sheridan and the many scientists in her multi-species line of research are trying to do is to re-inject something of that lost body of experience and expertise back into mainstream farming, attempting to integrate the best practice of grassland farming in the pre-intensive era with the best practice of the modern farm. It seeks to restore the traditional agro-ecosystem that maximizes inherent fertility, not necessarily cutting bag manure out, but making it largely redundant. The multi-species approach reduces reliance on artificial fertilizers with their associated spiraling cost and reduces their environmental impact, about which Helen will say more shortly. The primary target, of course, is productivity and general environmental quality, but that includes restoration of some of the lost biodiversity of the grazed or mown sward. Apart from the better fields and with the better soils on which the main focus is, on every farm there are still marginal fields and out-of-the-way corners where much of the traditional high level of biodiversity of the older fields still survives. And there are few places better than the Castle Meadow here in Birr to experience what that largely lost biodiversity was like, and to get to know something of the 30 grass species and 100 other grassland plants in and around the meadow, or in the actual meadow itself there would be 20 grass species, different grass species, and 90 or so other flowering plants, to better inform and equip you when you go home to look at what you have, and where it's worth our while taking the trouble to become familiar or more familiar with the different species, not only because they are central to schemes like acres, but for their own sake, for the greater understanding they can provide us with of an earlier agriculture, and for the greater appreciation of just how much there is to appreciate. So, grassland biodiversity begins with plants. But the plants are, of course, only the tip of the iceberg. Plant diversity is the very foundation of all biodiversity, and animal diversity depends on it entirely. Let me take two very common plants of the meadow by way of example. Two plants that must be everywhere on every farm in greater or lesser abundance, if not in the main fields on the farm. Now you might think that this floral display is part of County Arms' attempt to brighten the place up. But not so. This is oxeye daisy, which I'm sure we all know. One species. But at least 80 species of insects. A quarter of them with a particular preference for oxeye daisy, or dog daisy as we more usually call it here. At least 80 species feed on dog daisy. Butterflies, moths, flies, small beetles, all in search of its abundant pollen and nectar, or feeding on different parts of the plant. And this is black knapweed. Again, one of the commonest, most widespread of plants. One species. But this is the species with the highest production of nectar and pollen combined, and it supports as many as 50 species of insects and other invertebrates. And apart from the pollinators, where much of our emphasis tends to be, the most important in this case include many species of butterflies, and as we will see shortly, butterflies are in free fall. It supports dozens of other species, apart from the flowers, some of which are grazers of different parts of the plant. For example, the interest of the plant doesn't decline when the flowers have gone. If you look at the seed heads, up to 24 seed head associates have been recorded. Other insects feeding on these different parts of the plant. 9 gallflies and moths, their predators, parasites and parasitoids, mainly several species of small wasps. And that's just 2 out of dozens. And we could spend the rest of the morning looking at the extraordinary stories behind each of the plants, and I'll come back to that shortly. On the other hand, by way of contrast, if I had picked a bee orchid and put it up beside these 2 here on the table, beside the dog daisy and the knapweed, the botanists among you would be hopping up and down. And for good reason. But the biodiversity support value of the bee orchid is almost nil. And it would still be almost nil if it were much more common. Here is a very interesting table. If you look at that, it shows forage plants of particular benefit for pollinators in Western Europe, more or less in order of preference, etc. But the point I want to make is that they're all common plants. You know, it would take you, just go back onto your own farm or wherever you are familiar with, you'd pick up most of those in a very short time, apart, I think, there are 2 or 3 there which are not found here, or at least not found here in any numbers. So you probably have many of these, if not in meadows and pastures, then in verges and corners, and you should get to know them better. So picking up on that point, plant diversity is the very foundation of all biodiversity. When the plants go, everything that depends on the plants goes as well. I'll generalize on this in a moment, but to take just 2 groups of insects for which we happen to have figures. Look at butterflies first. 18% of butterflies are under threat of extinction in Ireland, and 15% more. Nearly so. That's nearly a third in all. But even more significant is the decline in the abundance of common species. For example, numbers are down by 83% since 2008 for the green-veined white, and 67-68% for several other common species. And these depend overwhelmingly on grassland habitat. And this is what I want to particularly emphasize here. It's not so much the loss of species that is most significant, really. It's the decline in their abundance. Few of the species that were present here 60, 70 years ago have actually disappeared. But what has changed, what has declined dramatically in many cases, is their frequency, their abundance, and the extent to which they are or could be part of people's experience in their everyday lives of the diversity of the living world and the potential for our lives to be enriched by appreciation of the sheer wonder of what this is all about. And not particularly rare things. Wild things, plants and animals, that were common 60 or 70 years ago are common no more, or they are less frequent than they used to be. The meadow brown, for example, the butterfly that takes its name from the grassland habitat, the meadow habitat, is still common, but in nothing like the numbers I remember. Insect populations have plummeted. Evidence for this is largely anecdotal, but it's the anecdotal evidence of people who know about these things and have their wits about them. But there have been several studies in recent years to quantify this collapse. A study published in 2017 reported a dramatic decline in flying insect populations in 62 German nature reserves, where biodiversity would be expected to be at its highest and best preserved, with a 76% decrease over 27 years, increasing to 82% drop in summer when populations are at their peak. And of course, when the insects go, so does everything else further up the food chain. Plants are the base of all food chains. Everything else depends on them. either directly if they're herbivores or at a further remove if they're carnivores. As their resources of food become scarcer, the creatures that depend on them become scarcer, and there's going to be increased competition for that food, which may result not only in general decline, but the disappearance of more vulnerable species. And the likelihood is that many rarer species have been lost was because of this diminution of habitat and the particular and more specialized resources that they require. The predicament of wild bees is a particularly good example, and an economically important one, of course, because they are responsible for something like 2/3 of all pollination. In this part of the country, we have 20 or so species, including 7 different bumblebees. Now, everybody knows that they feed on flowers, but not just any flowers. Bumblebees in particular have developed a close relationship with members of the pea family. And the two groups, bumblebees and pea flowers, have become extraordinarily adapted to each other structurally over the course of their 60 million year history. And the reason these flowers are so important for them is that legume pollen is especially high in protein and unusually rich in essential amino acids the bees can get nowhere else. And they provide abundant nectar. And this is equally important because of the quantity of nectar these insects need as adults to fuel their activities. So this is where, or why, the abundance of nectar-rich flower species, and not merely their presence on a list, is so important. Most of these wild flowers are still here. We are all familiar with the different wild clovers, vetches, and trefoils. But it's their abundance that counts. And most of these flowers are nothing like as abundant as they were 60 or 70 years ago. And of course, it's not just pollinators we're talking about, or not just bees we're talking about, bees and butterflies and the more charismatic species, if you like. Because grassland biodiversity also includes all the other invertebrates that feed on parts of the plants other than the nectar and pollen on offer in the flowers. To say nothing of the soil biota, out of sight, hidden and so scarcely noticed, but whose biodiversity has been equally compromised. Much of the nutrient applied in the early days was in excess of what the sward could utilize, and so, being soluble in water, lost in runoff and to groundwater, and ultimately to rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, where it has had an impact on the aquatic fauna comparable to that of changes in farm practice generally on dry land biodiversity. So it's no gilded memory that the rivers were full of fish 70 years ago. For with the decline in water quality went a decline in the invertebrate creatures on which they feed and in the general quality of their habitat. We failed to realize what was happening. We could have done had we paid closer attention. And in the decades since, we have gradually come to understand the unintended and unforeseen effects of our actions and begun to adapt our practices to halt the decline in aquatic biodiversity and to restore where we can what we have lost. The little cartoon you're looking at is an increasingly familiar example of where we did notice because we were paying attention. If you're driving around the country in a car at night in the 1950s, you had to stop at intervals to wipe away the moths on the windscreen. Not anymore, to our great delight, as our gentleman in 2020 seems to get. But the future, the prospects of the statistics I quoted are dire. And it's not the case, incidentally. I remember showing this to a group of intelligent young people a while ago, and they thought the third picture represented the fact that we would all be driving automatic cars in 30 years' time. So, of course, when the insects go, So does everything else further up the food chain, and birds are near the top. I grew up in Newbridge Street, on the edge of Birr, where on summer nights in my pre-teenage years, you could hear the call of the corncrake through the open window of the bedroom. And here in Birr, we're just a few miles from the Shannon Callows, where in those same years, the air was full of the bubbling whistle of the curlew. Now that call has more or less disappeared from the summer chorus in the Callows, down 85% since the 1970s. It may seem a long time ago, but it's still much less than my one lifetime. The great agrostologists, as they called themselves, of an earlier multi-species agriculture were not actually interested in the plant diversity of the sward or the insects and birds that depended on it from any particular interest or concern in biodiversity as such. They were interested in the productive and economic value it represented. And it's interesting today, while that is still the primary concern in the restoration of multi-species, the value of grassland diversity for its own sake, for biodiversity's own sake that is now also an economic element. And under acres, grassland is scored for payment on the basis of its plant diversity, and how that works is what John Muldowney will be talking about later in the morning. There is, of course, one other reason why we've come back to Birr for this event, and that's because it was here, actually, I think it was in this very room, if I remember correctly, that the book on the grasses of Ireland was launched in 2012, and which Teagasc, as Virginia told us, is relaunching today. Indeed, the meadow in the domain forms the frontispiece of the book. Now, this is not just a colourful description of the grass species in Ireland, on and off the farm, but it gives you a pen picture of each, as well as some idea of how well each of them had come to be known in farming a century ago, and how they were to be managed in different rotations, productively and sustainably under the different circumstances presented by different soils on different farms. And it also gives you some idea of the biodiversity value of the different species. So it's intended, more than anything else, as a manual to look at the grassy biodiversity on the margins of your own farm. And I guarantee you, if you read it carefully enough, it will open your eyes on how intelligent grassland management was at its best before the arrival of cheap petroleum. And it might help you to look at the land with a new appreciation, and who knows what ideas it might put into your head about the future. Because as you leaf through the pages, a new sort of awareness of how much is still there to work with will begin to suggest all sorts of new possibilities. And if your pocket is deep enough, there are still a few copies left of this other little book. This other little book, which deals specifically with the Castle Meadow, and that's available in the Castle Bookshop. But it also describes the non-grass species. This particular book describes the non-grass species in the meadow, and not just the Castle Meadow, but on the margins of your own farm. And I want to conclude by showing you two short introductory videos we made last year. One on the meadow in the castle, and the other on just one of the wild grasses, false oat, the wild grass that is at its most abundant and flowering just now, just to give some idea of how much more there is to be said about grass species that we would, for the most part, consider to be irrelevant to anything to do with farming. You can play these over and over, these two videos. You can play them over and over again if you like, because they're part of our YouTube Wildflower series, which give an account of nearly 150 of the wildflowers on the farm without you ever having to open a book. just click on your smartphone, put in Offaly wildflowers on the Offaly Heritage website, and then the name of the species, and you have 5 minutes, 5, 6, 7 minutes on the particular species in question. You can access any or all of these at any time, once you have 5 to 10 minutes to spare. And I'll put on the sales desk down at the bottom, I'll put cards with the details of how to access the YouTube series for anybody who might want to follow up on that. Okay, so we'll have a look now at, first of all, at the introductory video on the meadow itself, and then singling out this one species, false oat, which is at the tip of its flowering at the moment. The meadow here in Burghcastle is one of the outstanding features of the domain, valued today mainly for its aesthetic character. But 100 years ago, just about every other field in Ireland would have been much the same as this, with the same diverse assemblage of different grass species and wild flowers, grazed by cattle and sheep or fed to them in hay. But over the last 50 years or so, these species-diverse grasslands have all but disappeared, replaced by a monoculture of just one grass species, perennial ryegrass, and one other herb, white clover, because such a sward is capable of producing higher quantities of forage, but only if liberal quantities of artificial fertilizer and slurry are applied. Over the last couple of decades, we have become increasingly conscious of the hidden costs of this ryegrass monoculture. Not simply in monetary terms, because the manufacture of artificial fertilizer is very energy dependent, so the price of fertilizer has been steadily increasing and will continue to do so in the years to come. But over and beyond that, the nitrogen compounds in fertilizer are soluble in water, and much of the nitrate and ammonia applied to the fields is lost to groundwater and finds its way into watercourses, where it is largely responsible for the poor quality of the rivers and lakes in parts of rural Ireland, only a fraction of the fertilizer applied being taken up by the plants it is intended to nourish. And then there is also the nutritional cost for the cattle grazing on these ryegrass pastures, or the hay and silage they provide, compared to the much more varied and nutritionally balanced diet provided by a meadow, which differs little in nutritional quality from the mixed herbaceous swards grazed by their wild ancestors. The landscape itself has been simplified by the removal of hedgerows in order to make bigger fields across which increasingly large farm machines can more easily travel, replacing the more irregular hedgerow-enclosed patchwork of the earlier, smaller fields. Apart from the economic, environmental and nutritional disadvantages, the switch to a ryegrass monoculture has had serious effects on the biodiversity of the fields. Now, few of the wild plants and animals that were here 50 years ago have actually disappeared, but what has changed is their abundance and the extent to which they are or can be part of the experience of wild diversity in our everyday lives. An added urgency is given to the conservation of species-diverse grassland by the results of a recently published survey by the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, which found that over the last 90 years, the number of 10 kilometre squares across Ireland occupied by native species has decreased by 56%, the decline in species-diverse grassland being particularly serious. And then, apart from the plants themselves, every species in the meadow supports an assemblage of insects and other invertebrates, some plants having higher value in this regard than others. These insects feed on all the different parts of the plant, some on the roots, others on the leaves or stems, and very many are pollinators. And because plants can't seek each other out in the way animals can, the flowers need outside help to transfer the pollen. For this, they can use the wind, which is how grasses and most trees are pollinated, or they can enlist the help of animals, which in our part of the world means insects for the most part. Nearly half of insect pollinators are bees, of which we have 100 species in Ireland, 21 of them bumblebees, and 78 solitary bees, such as these, each of which has her own individual apartment which she provisions for her small family. Almost uniquely, bees use both nectar and pollen as foods and rely on them totally for both adult and larval nutrition. So the decline in the abundance of nectar-producing flowers means that bees in particular decline as a result. Bumblebees are especially vulnerable. They need to maintain a body temperature of 35 degrees, and they are able to do this by means of the heat generated by their flight muscles, which beat at the scarcely believable rate of 200 times a second. This uses up an enormous amount of energy, which is why the abundance of nectar-rich flower species such as clovers and vetches, and not merely their presence on a list, is so important. Butterflies also depend heavily on grassland flowers. As adults, the only thing they feed on is the nectar of flowers, and as caterpillars they feed on other parts of the plants, each species having its preferred range of flowers. There is a particularly close association between butterflies and plants in the pea family, because butterflies evolved around 100 million years ago from a group of night-flying moths whose caterpillars fed on ancestral legumes, and the evolution of the two has run in parallel ever since. The caterpillars of many others feed on grasses, among the most common of these grass feeders being the meadow brown and the small heath. Hoverflies are also very important pollinators, sometimes rivaling bees in importance. Several groups of moths are important pollinators, but they are less obvious to us because the adults of most moths are out and about when most of us are asleep. A common species is the small elephant hawk moth, which feeds mainly on bedstraws. The six-spot burnet moth is an eye-catching exception because it visits the flowers of thistles and knapweeds during the day, while its caterpillars are feeding on bird's foot trefoil. One of the species at the top of the table in terms of all-round value for pollinators is ox-eye daisy, on which more than 70 insect species have been recorded, and is particularly important more generally because of its ease of establishment from seed mixtures. Several other species that are common in the meadow also rank among the top dozen in a general classification that takes ease of establishment into account. They include red clover, which ranks second in this general classification, bird's foot trefoil, which ranks third, self-heal fourth, and black knapweed fifth, along with cat's ear, common or tufted vetch, and kidney vetch, seen here with the small blue butterfly, the food plant of its caterpillars. We could fill a library with stories of all the tiny lives that are lived out in this microcosmic jungle. And for all that we know about them nowadays, the more we know, the more we realise how much more there is to know. The great young mid-19th century Offaly naturalist and microscopist Mary Ward was a regular visitor to Burcastle, which was the home of her first cousin, the 3rd Earl of Ross, and she had a particular interest in the insects of meadowland. And in one of her books, she has an illustration in which she imagines them as tiny personalities dancing around a quaking grass maypole. It may be fantasy, but the stories of the lives they really lead, each hidden from our casual, unobservant eyes, are more amazing than anything we could ever imagine. Over the course of our wildflower outings, we've now met many of the plant families that provide the food and fibre, as well as the medicinal and ornamental plants that are so important to our human welfare. But by far the most important family in this regard is the family of the grasses. And first among them in importance are the cereal grasses. Wheat and barley, oats and rye, millet and sorghum, maize and rice, which are the foundation of agriculture all over the world. 70% of all crops are grasses, and just 3, maize, wheat and rice, provide fully 50% of the calories we consume, as well as much of the protein. And in addition to that, there are the great variety of forage grasses, which are the basis of animal husbandry, which is so particularly important in the agriculture of a country like Ireland, where the principal crop is grass. Their lack of bright colours hides the diversity of grasses from our colour-tuned eyes. But the grasses are among the largest families of flowering plants, with between 10 and 12,000 different species. And in fact, they belong to the same cohort of the flowering plants that includes the irises and lilies, the orchids, daffodils and onions, where the floral parts are usually in threes and the leaves are long and blade-like. But unlike all of these other distant cousins, the grasses are pollinated not by insects but by the wind, which is why we don't notice their flowers as readily unless we are prone to hay fever. The flowers are tiny and are usually grouped in small clusters called spikelets, which are subtended by chaffy-like structures called glooms. Here in false oat, the spikelet consists of 2 florets, an upper hermaphrodite one and a lower male one, each subtended by a pair of glooms, the upper one much the larger of the 2. Each floret consists of a boat-shaped bit called a lemma, which encloses the 3 stamens and a single carpel, roofed over by a deck-like pallia. If we think of the lemma as a little boat, the stamens and carpel are below deck, the deck being the pallia. The stamens have the thinnest of filaments, and as soon as the flower opens, these elongate rapidly, flipping the anthers out of the boat so that they dangle loosely over the sides. The pollen is at first shed onto a pair of little spoons on the lower tip of each anther, where it is stored until the breeze carries it away. Pollen release is almost explosive, all the pollen released at once. The feathery design of the stigmas maximizes the surface area for intercepting wind-borne pollen. The flowers only open in warm, dry weather, usually early in the day, before most of us are around to observe it. Before we leave the grasses for now, we ought to at least briefly admire the superlative architectural design of the stem. False oat, the stem can be more than 1 metre high, and it's less than 2 millimetres in thickness, but it will never break unless cut by grazing teeth or mowing blade. Spaced stems cushion each other in the wind, and the strengthening woody tissue is not embedded in a solid stem as it is in most plants, but distributed in a circle of separate bundles all the way round the stem, which is hollow, and this minimizes weight. The leaf blades are upright, presenting the maximum photosynthesizing surface area for such densely clustered plants at this height. In today's agriculture, wild grasses have been consigned to the margins of fields, hedgerows and roadsides, and the occasional remaining patch of traditional meadow, such as this wonderful example here in Burcastle Domain. But 100 years ago it was very different, because a remarkable level of sophisticated understanding of the ecological characteristics and the forage qualities of the different grass species had been developed, and a remarkable level of self-sustaining productivity had been achieved. But like the grasses themselves, this vast body of understanding has been swept to the margins of agriculture. Long ago, and especially in countries like France and Sweden, falsalt had a very high repute as a forage grass, but it needed to be managed properly and in the proper rotations. And you needed to understand how to manage it properly and what the proper rotations were. But who knows, in the new agriculture that awaits us around the corner of global warming and climate change, falsalt may yet have an important role to play in Ireland's farming of the future.
That was really excellent presentation by John. Catherine, it really painted a picture of, I suppose, the change over time, what's been happening, how we're impacted, and the reference towards, how can balance the both together going into the future. So I thought that was brilliant. Now, we don't have a huge amount of time today, so we'll get straight into it. Just to mention to everybody that there's details of where you can get the book in the chat function there. Just have a look at chat there, and Catherine has put the details in there, so you can have a look there. So Catherine, Keena, we might go straight to questions because we've only 5 minutes or so left. So we might like to get through a few of those if that's okay.
Yeah, so I suppose a couple of really key ones to get to. The question asked where to get the species to sow such things, and we absolutely do not recommend sowing wildflowers. Flowers, I call them. Wildflowers grow wild. They are not sown on, and we particularly do not want them on farmland. So there is a leaflet there, because it is a difficult, and it's not for today to explain why, but there's a very good leaflet from Biodiversity, the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, Department of Agriculture, NPWS, ourselves, was promoted, not sowing flowers on land, that wildflowers grow wild. So that leaflet is on the websites there. Maybe that's for another day, Cathal. And the other really important question that came up there is, we are where we are and how to move forward. And I think that leads us really into next week's, the other half of the event in Bar. I think, as you say, John Feehan set the scene, and the second half of the presentations, which will be on next Friday, is how are we moving forward, how to move forward. So fantastic development with acres, that the farmer with a meadow like the one behind us could be getting €450 per hectare to pay for the ecosystem services, because there will be less production compared to the ryegrass sward. So that's a huge development, and John Muldowney outlined that, and outlined for the first time the scores of the grassland in Ireland that's been farmed, the extensive grassland. So that will be very interesting next week, followed then by Helen Sheridan, who gave kind of where we are now with the types of grassland that are still out there, and how to manage it. And in a nutshell, it's for a species like that, is no lime, no fertilizer, must be farmed, must be grazed or cut. And I suppose I am inspired by a lot of people that I work with who talk about how nature can recover. And I think we're at a very exciting time now where we don't want to go back to the small fields and all the fields full of flowers like that, because we wouldn't have the quantity of food. But there is a balance, and I think now we're at that point where we really want to hold on to what we have, because we cannot recreate that. That's the point. It's not a case of going out sowing that. We cannot recreate it. Once it's gone, it's gone. So so listening next week to continue the story.
Yeah, and just for anyone that's maybe listening, not reading, the reprinted book of Grasses of Ireland by John Feehan, Helen Sheridan, and Damien Egan is launched at events, available to purchase for €35 from Teagasc Oak Park, and the number is 059 917 0200. Catherine Casey, when we have you here, a question for you. I was just doing a bit of messing around there during John's presentation. It just popped into my head when he was talking about the past and stuff. And I just looked up poems about different biodiversity over the years and the change. And a lot of the big names like Seamus Heaney and Yeats and Dylan Thomas write a lot about all the biodiversity we had over the years. But why is it so important to the Heritage Council?
Well, I mean, biodiversity is important in its own right, and the Heritage Council covers the built natural and cultural heritage. So I always want to emphasise the inherent value of our biodiversity. You hear a lot about ecosystem services and what biodiversity does for humans, but it has a value in and of itself. But I agree, it's also inspired generations of poets and artists, and many of our farmers have been poets and artists themselves and always appreciate. And I think people who live in the countryside, they don't necessarily look at one particular part of their heritage. They look at it as a whole. So they'll think of the biodiversity, the field names, the stories that went with that, the place names that are associated with it. And all of that is an important part of our heritage, all wrapped up together, the hedgerows that go around the field, the archaeology under the field. So really, farming and on all aspects of heritage definitely go hand in hand. So we can see them, as an integral part of the identity of and culture of an area.
And the event in Burr demonstrated, you could see what John was showing us. It's unbelievable what we could see there in front of us. The activity, the species richness of it, the abundance. How important is that to our heritage to have sites like that? Not just sites like that, but maybe across different parts of the country. Much more abundant.
Behind me, Cathal.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, give all credit to Burr Castle, but as Catherine says, there's farmers all over the country who have identified and protected these sites, and it's so important that we know about and maintain and protect the sites that we have, the species-rich grasslands and the old grasslands. And many of the farmers who have them know the value of them, and it's great now that schemes like Acres are there to protect that. But there's lots that other farmers can do as well. Somebody mentioned we are where we are. That's totally true. There are other things that other farmers can do, reducing inputs, and there are other aspects of schemes that can protect other parts of the heritage and the biodiversity of the farm. So I think we'll hear a bit about that from John Muldowney next week. The Acres programme and other schemes that are there, and good farming practice and good agricultural condition. There's a lot of good policy structure in place now that can really work on the biodiversity that we have, and helping farmers who want to do the best to really take the best actions they can for farming and biodiversity.
Yeah, and Catherine Keena, a quick one to finish with you maybe, because I know we're out of time, but I suppose what I'm looking at here is that there is room for both the production and the species-rich grasslands. I suppose what we don't want to happen here is to have just almost like zoos of species-rich grassland. We want it dotted around the country, don't we?
Absolutely. So there are farms that are full of this, but probably more likely there are farms that have a field of this, the last field remaining, and it's to inspire them that this is important. Yeah.
Brilliant. Look, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this morning. I know we did things slightly different, but I think I just want to thank John, Professor John Feehan. I thought it was a really excellent presentation. I thought it was very thought-provoking as well, and it leaves a lot for us to think about over the weekend for certain. And just big thank you out to Catherine Casey and Dr. Catherine Keena as well for joining us this morning. Really interesting conversation, and pity we didn't have some more time, but maybe we'll chat again. And like Catherine said, this is part one of a part two, so we're going to have lots more about it next week, and we will give more time to going through questions in more detail next week. Just big thank you to Vaughn Marr that helps out in the background and running the show. And just Catherine kind of mentioned already, but for next week for part two, we're back again to look at the more extensive grassland biodiversity event, Teagasc of Ireland, and we're going to chat to Pat Morrison from the Department of Agriculture about engagement and extent of extensive grassland under acres, and Dr. Helen Sheridan from UCD to talk about types and management of extensive grassland, and that's not to be missed. So do tune in again next Friday at 9:30. But until then, I hope you have a great bank holiday weekend. And for anybody travelling down to the lovely sunny southeast in Wexford for Fleadh Cheoil, hope you have a really good time. And with that, slán go fóill.
Slán, Kermagat.